All right, guys, welcome back. This is part 2 of our Constitution lecture. We're in lesson 2, the Constitution of Unit 1 Foundations. And remember, in your Cornell notes, we're doing those. This is going to be in the big right-hand section of your notes. You're just going to carry on right where we left off from part 1. And we're talking about the structure and organization of the Constitution. The Constitution is the United States government. It is our rule book. It is the highest law of our land, and it's divided into 7 articles. Article 1 is Congress, or the legislative branch. They make the laws. They're comprised of a Senate and a House of Representatives. Article 2 is the executive branch, tasked with carrying out the laws of our country, made up of the president, the vice president, and all the president's men, the cabinet, basically, those executive departments and independent agencies that help basically enforce the country's laws. Article 3 is the judicial branch, or the Supreme Court, 9 Supreme Court justices in the lower courts. And then we get to Article 4, which sets up this idea of federalism. Why is that not going? There we go. Federalism in Article 4 is where powers share between local, state, and the national government. We talked about in Part 1 jurisdiction, which is basically who has control over what. And as far as major things go, this little Venn diagram here is pretty useful. But you can see like the state government, like the one we have in Austin, they're in charge of the state of Texas school children. All of education is under the purview, the jurisdiction of the state government. Driver's licenses, marriage certificates, death certificates, all those things exist under the state government's jurisdiction. They have control over those things, mainly because those things are not mentioned in the Constitution. And Article 10 gives the states those powers. But more on that later. The national government, that's our government in Washington, D.C., with the president, the Congress, and the Supreme Court. The national government is in charge of big things like declaring war against other nations, having a military, regulating trade, establishing new states, the post office, the postal system, making money. We have the Federal Reserve banks that print and sometimes even destroy our money and regulate our currency and all those things. And then there's some things that both the state and the national government both do. Like they both give certain taxes, levy taxes. Like you have the state sales taxes in certain states, and you have property taxes. And then, of course, the national government has the income tax from the 16th Amendment. So these are some of the things that they both do. Like they both also are in charge of maintaining law and order. Both the state and the national governments are in charge of providing for the public welfare, as we've seen during this pandemic, to varying degrees of success. And there's big debate over what that means. But this is federalism, the idea that power is shared. And that is Article 4 of the Constitution. Now, running throughout this, you have these various Enlightenment principles. Remember that our government, we the people, established this government in the Constitution. When the framers wrote this up, these Enlightenment ideas are woven into it, like republicanism. Republicanism is the idea that we elect those who represent us in our government. We don't actually rule ourselves. So here's this poster here. Remember, we're not ancient Athens. We don't actually get to make our own laws as a citizen. Like I'm a citizen of the United States, of the state of Texas. I can't make a law myself. That's particularly true for Texas because we don't have the initiative here in our state. But I can elect those by voting for a representative who will basically carry my ideas into our government and hopefully, represent my interests in our government. That's a republic. That's where the term republicanism comes from. We've established a republic. Do not get that confused, though, with the political parties, the Democrats versus the Republicans. That is unrelated. That is a different thing. We'll talk about that a little later. But republicanism is the idea of a system of government where the people have a say, and that say is in them getting to vote for those who will rule them or represent them. That's the kind of government we technically have. Popular sovereignty, we talked about in lesson 1. Remember, this is Alexis de Tocqueville, that French dude. He had these 5 values, these 5 things that made America just awesome sauce that he wrote about from the 1830s in his book entitled Democracy in America. And one of those values was populism. And that really translates to popular sovereignty, which means that the people are in charge. Again, it's a republic form of government, so we're in charge by voting, but we do have a say. We decide who is in power. We have the ultimate say. So that is popular sovereignty, and that's in the Constitution. In the first 3 words, it's there. We, the people of the United States, make this government, for all eternity, for the betterment of our society. And it's also woven into the first 3 articles, which establish our 3 separate but equal branches. Remember these branches right here: Congress, President, and the Supreme Court. They are decided basically by the people, even sometimes in a very confusing way, like the president with the Electoral College, but nonetheless, they are decided ostensibly by us, Americans. Americans. Okay. I don't know why it's doing that. I'm gonna have to manually switch the page. That's such a bother. So hard. Okay. E pluribus unum. That is the national motto that we have adopted, and it means out of many we are one. And guess what language that is? Remember, the founding fathers really venerated or esteemed, and they really liked the Roman Republic, right? And the language of the Roman Republic and eventually the Roman Empire that it slid down into, that was Latin. So e pluribus unum, what language is that? That's a dead language known as Latin, but you can still learn that. And if you choose to become like a lawyer or something, you will have no choice but to learn a lot of Latin. Also, if you become a doctor or veterinarian, somebody has to learn a lot of medical terms, which a lot of you guys in the Healthcare Academy probably will. You'll be learning a lot of Latin, so just get used to that. But our motto, out of many we are one, you probably have seen this before, even if you don't immediately recall it. That's on our money, right? Any coin that you have, any currency in the United States, it's stamped with that. And it has different meanings for different people, but if you think about it, it's, out of the 13 different colonies, we became one nation. Out of today, the 50 states that we have, we are one country, the United States of America, under our Constitution. And also on a more cultural level, I guess you could say, out of many different people, we are one people, which I think is so important in today's divisive climate, that we remember we're all Americans, regardless of your skin color, regardless of your background, regardless of how much money you have, where you come from, where your family came from, what you believe, what your sexual orientation is, regardless of any of those things. If you're born here, you are an American citizen. And even if you immigrated here, you could still become an American citizen. We all are united in the fact that we love being here in this country. This is the country for us. That's what makes us Americans. So that's a very powerful motto, especially in today's climate. There's also another motto, "In God We Trust," that you might see on money. That is the official motto legally from 1956 during the height of the Red Scare and the Cold War. Basically, we were in a war against communism and the Soviet Union, and that's Russia. And to make ourselves different from those godless communists, we wanted to emphasize our religion. However, there's a problem with that. Under the United States Constitution and the Bill of Rights, the First Amendment says we have a freedom of religion. And that means that Americans should be allowed to worship the way they want, even if that means not worshiping at all, not having any belief, being like an atheist. You should be allowed to believe even that, whatever you want. And so this motto is kind of contradictory to that, but you have to understand the historical context. It was created during this heightened time of the Cold War when everybody was scared that a nuclear weapon was going to fall on their heads. And we wanted to emphasize how we were different from our enemies, those communists who did not believe in God at all. So more on that in a minute when we talk about the Bill of Rights. In 1787, remember, the Constitutional Convention was underway. We were throwing out those Articles of Confederation because why? They were weak. They were so weak. Couldn't even stop a little rebellion in little tiny Massachusetts there. Daniel Shay's rebellion. Remember, it showed how weak it was. And so remember, they draft this new government, which becomes the Constitution. And by 1789, it's ready to go. But there is still these opponents who disagreed with having this new, stronger form of government in the Constitution. And these opponents to passing the Constitution or ratifying it, they were called the Anti-Federalists, which of course makes those who wanted the Constitution the Federalists. And these are kind of our first political parties or factions, if you will. Political party is like when you belong to a group. It's not like an actual party. It's when you belong to a group of people that have similar ideals about government. And so it's for power to get power. That's why you form this faction or this group or this party. So the Federalists were those who wanted the Constitution, and the Anti-Federalists are those who were against the Constitution. Now, why would somebody be against the Constitution? Well, remember, it's kind of going back to what we had just left with Britain. Britain had a very strong central government, and here we are in the Constitution creating a new, very strong central government. They had a lot of fears that we were going to be big hypocrites and return to what we had opposed in the American Revolution. The other main point that the Anti-Federalists really had, especially guys like Thomas Jefferson, who was an Anti-Federalist, and the famous firebrand like Patrick Henry, also from Virginia, was that the new government laid out in the Constitution did not include fundamental rights for its people. There were no protections. Remember, Articles 1 through 3 set up the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. Article 4 is federalism, the idea that power is shared. Article 5 is the amendment process, how to add amendments or make changes to the Constitution. Article 6 sets up the Supremacy Clause, saying that the Constitution is the highest law, the highest authority in our country. And Article 7 lays out how it was supposed to be ratified. Nowhere in that does it lay out, I'm supposed to have some freedoms, like freedom of speech to say stupid, weird things and try to make my students laugh. It doesn't say that anywhere in there. Nowhere in there does it say you have a right to bear arms or weapons or whatever people think that means. Nowhere in there does it say that you have a right to privacy or the right to a trial by jury. And nowhere in there does it say any of those things because it wasn't in there. And that's the biggest problem that Anti-Federalists had, and that's why they refused to pass this new government. And what eventually will happen, just like we saw during the convention itself, is that a compromise will be reached, okay? The Federalists, they're going to get the Constitution. They're going to get their big, strong central government. The Anti-Federalists, they're going to get these basic fundamental rights and protections for the people. And that will come in the form of the Bill of Rights, which is the first 10 amendments added to the Constitution. And remember, an amendment is like an add-on, an amendment add-on. It changes the Constitution or it adds to it. And that is where we get those basic fundamental protections from our governments. And these are rights that we have that the government cannot take away from us. Now, the Federalist and Anti-Federalist, if you're curious about this, you're going to love your senior year when you have government class. But basically, we'll talk more about political parties. This is before the government was, before the United States was even founded, because we're not really the United States of America until the Constitution passes. And the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, these were these two groups debating the actual passage of the Constitution itself. What's going to happen is it's going to morph into the Federalists led by guys here like Alexander Hamilton and George Washington, his mentor, his father figure, and John Jay, the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. These Federalists are going to continue on. The Anti-Federalists, they lost because the Constitution gets adopted, even though they do get their Bill of Rights. And they will eventually become like the Democratic Republicans under Thomas Jefferson, and eventually James Madison switches sides, and you get James Monroe on there and stuff. And then it goes from that to just the Democratic Republicans, but they were kind of divided based on where they live, sectional differences. And then the next political differences are going to be the Democrats under like Jackson. He was the first president that was actually a Democrat versus the Whigs. The Whig Party emerges, and then by Lincoln you have the Republicans, and then eventually you go through some radical changes, and kind of the parties flip and flop on issues, and they add these groups and that groups. But eventually today, you know, we have the Democrats and the Republicans, but this is kind of where it all began. All right, and the last thing I want to talk with you guys about in our lesson is the actual Bill of Rights. And in your notes, I would be listing these out, and feel free to, you know, add some meat to those bones. You could add stuff on the left, or you could add stuff in the big right-hand section, but make sure in the right-hand section you at least write, the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, and then write as we go through each of these amendments and what they gave. Okay, these rights that cannot be taken away from us. So the First Amendment, the first add-on to the Constitution, says we have the 5 freedoms: the freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, and the right to petition. Let's talk about those briefly. The freedom of speech, what does that mean? I have a right to say whatever I want. It's my God-given right as an American. Well, it's your right that you have from the government, because it's in the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, which is our highest law. But the freedom of speech means that if there is an injustice happening, you are supposed to speak out against it. As we've seen many demonstrators do this year in 2020, they are exercising their fundamental First Amendment right to freedom of speech. To speak out when there is wrongs done. The freedom of religion, that is the right to worship as you please, as you see fit, even if that's no religion at all. And that's where we have problems today with, like, people wanting to have school prayer read over the announcements and stuff. Like, let's have a sermon. Let's bring some Jesus into schools. But you can't really do that, because you can't compel students to believe in Jesus Christ. You can't compel students to believe in Muhammad, the prophet, or other religious figures from different faiths, because you're supposed to be able to have a freedom to worship as you want. And this was done because the framers existed in a world where many people had died over religious differences between, like, Catholics and Protestants and whatnot. In fact, many of the founding fathers themselves had very kind of radical religious views for the day. Some of them were deists. Some of them, like John Adams, were from Puritan roots. So that's the freedom of religion. Again, you don't want to force anybody's religion upon them. Now, in like history class, and social studies, am I allowed to talk about the history of religion? Yeah, of course. In fact, I can't talk about my class without talking about religion, because religion is so important to people. It's caused a lot of things to happen in our past, things that affect us directly to this day. But what I cannot do is say, hey, I'm a Jewish person, which I am. I'm not a practicing Jew, but my mother's family's Jewish, so I'm Jewish. But I can't force my beliefs on you. If you have questions and you want to know more about something, you're free to ask. But we can't force religion on others, because we have that fundamental freedom of religion. Freedom of the press, still in that First Amendment, guys. First Amendment is huge. Freedom of the press means the newspapers, reporters, they have a freedom to report the news. Now, in today's world, with the internet and with social media, media itself, that's how you get things. That's a very complicated issue, because you don't have journalistic integrity with everybody that's spouting off their own views that are being taken as fact. And that's our job, to basically hold people accountable, to make sure we have journalists reporting the truth, or at least trying to get to the truth, rather than spouting propaganda and just trying to make us believe or feel certain things, really, really, get us riled up about certain stuff. But in our country, there's supposed to be a freedom of the press. The news is supposed to be able to report what they want, and that is so important. That is one of the things that fundamentally separates us from dictatorships like Russia. In Russia, if you are a news establishment and you report that the government, like under Vladimir Putin, is doing wrong, you get silenced real quick, and people don't get to hear those important voices of dissent. Assembly. The freedom and the right to assemble is so important for protests. People can come together for protest and petition. You see a paper and you put signatures on it and stuff to move forward a cause. That's again for protest. So those are the First Amendment 5 freedoms. Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. What does this mean in today's world? I don't know. I'm not a constitutional scholar, but I can tell you a few things. When this was written in 1789 and eventually ratified 1791, they had militiamen, and militias were basically a community law enforcement group that was made up of community members, because they did not have a police force. Our taxes pay for a lot of things. Taxes are very important. They pay for schools, they pay for roads, they pay for, the water treatment plants. They pay for all the things that make our society and our civilization function. And if we didn't have taxes, we wouldn't have those things. They wouldn't be funded. But back in the day, they didn't have, tax-funded police forces. So the people of the community had to be the police force. And so that meant that the members of the community had to be able to own a firearm. And that's where that Second Amendment right comes from, because the British tried to take away their weapons, like there at Lexington Concord. There's a rabbit outside the window. Sorry, I was distracted. Okay. Now, what that means in today's society, because we do have police forces, is very different, and that's up for debate. But yeah, it does say in the Second Amendment that in order to have a well-maintained militia, the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So this is possibly something that we call has become antiquated. Like, this is outdated. Maybe it needs to be revamped. But the only way, and according to Article 5, to change the Constitution is to amend it. So we would need a new constitutional amendment in order to change Article 2, in order to try to, really fundamentally alter our gun safety in the United States. A new amendment would be required, and the problem is it's really, really hard to get a new amendment passed. It would take 2/3 majorities in Congress to propose one, or state conventions to propose one, and then 3/4 of all the states in order to pass it. And that's only happened 27 times in our nation's history, from 1789 until 2020. Only 27 amendments have passed. That's how difficult it is to change the Constitution. And here's the first 10 that we're talking about right now. Article 3 is also antiquated. It's outdated. It's old. Because this one refers to the Quartering Acts, the fact that the British were forcing colonists here to house British soldiers. Like, knock, knock, who's there? It's the British redcoat. We need to sleep in your bed. Make way. Okay, have my bed, sir. Please, sir, please have my bed. You can sleep there. I'll sleep on the straw floor. Okay, that was how the Quartering Act supposedly went, right? Well, that doesn't happen anymore. We don't have like US soldiers knocking on our door wanting to take over our rooms. So that one's a little bit outdated, but there you go. No quartering of soldiers, no quartering, no housing of troops. The Fourth Amendment to the Constitution, the Fourth Amendment of the Bill of Rights, is about arrests and searches, illegal searches and seizures. So remember how smugglers like John Hancock, their ships were being boarded by the British using those writs of assistance. And then if they were found guilty, they'd have to go to those admiralty courts and whatnot. You know, those are part of our grievances in the Declaration of Independence when we broke up with Britain. Well, to fix that, and you'll see like the Third Amendment, a lot of these rights that were given, they were based off of complaints that we had under the British. We're trying to fix those things to make sure it doesn't happen under our new form of government. But anyway, under the Fourth Amendment, this is where if the police or the law enforcement want to search our private establishments, you know, our ships or our houses or our rooms or our cars today, I guess they're wagons back then, they have to have what's called a search warrant issued by a judge. And that is how they can enter and search through our private belongings, our private property. Interestingly, the Fourth Amendment kind of by doing this creates an inherent, it's not spelled out, but it's there, right to privacy, which is later used like in the 1970s to justify by the Supreme Court a right of a woman to choose if she wants to have an abortion or not. That's in the famous Supreme Court case Roe v. Wade. They cite that Fourth Amendment inherent right to privacy. So that's where that exists. Fifth Amendment is really big. There's a lot of parts to it. But basically, it's dealing like the Fifth, Sixth, Seventh, and the Eighth Amendments are all dealing with your rights in trial, in court. So the Fifth Amendment says that you cannot be accused of the same crime twice. Like if you get acquitted, your trial gets let out, or you get rendered innocent in a verdict, you cannot be put on trial for that same thing twice. That's called double jeopardy. There's also in the Fifth Amendment, famously, I have the right to remain silent. Fifth Amendment, you do not have to say anything that would make you appear guilty in the court of law. No self-perjury. Well, that's not, perjury is a separate thing. But anyway, you don't have to say anything that would make you appear guilty in the court of law. So that's why you see those TV shows, they say, I plead the fifth. I'm going to maintain my right to silence. And there's also things about eminent domain and other stuff we'll talk about later. The Sixth Amendment guarantees you a fair and speedy trial. Remember, it would take months sometimes for colonists to just be put in front of a judge. And then that judge was already skewed against them over in England or in Halifax, Nova Scotia in Canada. So a fair and speedy trial is the Sixth Amendment. The Seventh Amendment guarantees that in civil cases, you will get to be judged by a jury of your peers. Peers are people who are like you. They're from your community. They have the similar backgrounds as you. You will not be judged by some far away judge. The Eighth Amendment, this is no cruel or unusual punishment. This sets up why we have, for instance, Guantanamo Bay in Cuba versus on American soil, because we are not allowed to like torture prisoners on American soil legally. But it also says, it also establishes like the ways in which we execute prisoners today. There's a debate whether that's humane or not, but no cruel or unusual punishment. It also sets limitations on no excessive bail to get out of jail for your bail. The Ninth Amendment says that anything that we haven't mentioned doesn't mean it's not a right that you have. That's a right that you as a person still possess. Any right not mentioned goes to you. And number 10 quickly adds to that. But by the way, any of these rights that we haven't mentioned in the Constitution, anything that previously has not been talked about, the states can have power over those things. So that's how like the state government of Texas has power over your education and marriage and death certificates and whatnot. Because it's not mentioned explicitly or directly in the Constitution, the states get power over that. All right. Now, we are going to talk so much more about these amendments throughout the course of this class, but hopefully that gives you a brief overview of them. Make sure you've written them in your notes, and don't forget to do your summary. Summary answers the essential question. There it is. Make sure you answer that at the bottom of your notes, and peace out. Thank you guys so much. Bye.